Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, about the newest killer licensed from Hellraiser, the Hell Priest of the Cenobites, commonly known as Pinhead. Before we knew anything about Chapter 21, I assumed the killer for the Autumn chapter was going to be original. From all the teasers we'd gotten, I'd assumed that the next killer would be the Vampire Man teased by the Observer's Tome 7 entries in the Universus Alveo. And many other people had had the same idea. FYI, I still think he's most likely coming as our next original killer. But when it was revealed that by DVD leaks that the next killer was going to be licensed and coming without a survivor, the guessing and speculation frenzy was immense. Springtrap, Candyman, Pennywise, Chucky, even Jack Baker were floated as potential killers for the roster. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure the race was between Candyman and Springtrap for the longest time. Between the movie coming out fairly soon, the lack of an associated survivor, and the rabid fandom that Candyman enjoys in our community, I thought, and honestly hoped, it was going to be him. Which made me very pleasantly surprised when a string of teasers started pointing in a different direction. We were getting letters teased in screenshots on Twitter, a weird waveform audio posted in the DVD official Discord. And by the time this trailer hit, those of us who knew what we were getting. Hellraiser was coming to Dead by Daylight, and the PTB arrived with a new killer, the Cenobite, on August 17th. And I just want to cut to the chase here. I am absolutely overjoyed that Pinhead has turned up in the fog. Look, Hellraiser has been a favourite movie series of mine for almost as long as I've loved horror, and the aesthetic and themes of Hellraiser have been carried over into media that has changed my life. Alongside Jacob's Ladder and the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, Hellraiser is one of the big inspirations for my favourite video game franchise of all time, Silent Hill. Especially Silent Hill 2, that carries themes of bondage, extreme torture and sexual deviancy that Hellraiser has always been about. And the image of the Cenobites as pale, inhuman torturers with mutilated features and a priest-like affect had persisted in dark fantasy and science fiction horror ever since Hellraiser, such as the Dark Eldar homunculus covens of Warhammer 40,000, Fornicus the Lord of Bondage and Pain in the Cabin in the Woods, and the new Phyrexians of Magic the Gathering. And it all started with this guy. And he's here now, taking his rightful place among other legends of horror in Dead by Daylight. But what is a Cenobite? Who actually is Pinhead? And why am I so happy that he's come to our little game? Well, let's take a look. The Cenobites, in their simplest terms, are extra-dimensional horrors that are summoned to our world by the Lament configuration. One of several puzzle boxes created by the French toymaker Philippe Lemarchand in the 18th century at the commission of Duke de Lisle, a noble obsessed with the occult. Once a curious mind solves the box, it opens a door to hell, and the Cenobites will emerge to share the most depraved pleasures of hell with whoever opened it. But in perhaps the greatest understatement I will ever make on this channel, the Cenobites' idea of pleasure is a little, odd. Because the Cenobites are so old and live in, well, a dimension of eternal suffering, the only thing they really feel anymore is indescribably cruel agony to anyone else. Not that they really know or care, they're like religious devotees so adherent to their faith that the idea of this perhaps not being a great idea doesn't process in their minds. And if they're like religious cultists, then Pinhead is their high priest. He is the leader of the Cenobites and the only character to appear in every Hellraiser film to date. In life, he was Captain Elliot Spencer, a British Army officer during World War I, who suffered from PTSD after his participation in the legendarily bloody Battle of the Somme. He became nihilistic, losing his faith in God and his fellow man, and sought hedonistic pleasures to bury himself in. And that brought him to India in the 1920s, when he found the Lament configuration and was dragged to hell to turn into a Cenobite. But most of that backstory is necessary to fully understand who Pinhead is. it only really got expanded upon in the sequel Hellbound. In the original movie, his role is much simpler, and it sets the tone for all his future appearances and his status as a horror icon of the 80s. He was an explorer in the furthest reaches of experience, who gave those looking for the darkest pleasures far more than they could handle. That's all. He wasn't a big convoluted character with a ton of elaborate backstory. He wasn't even the main antagonist of his own movie. The late 80s was an age of masked slashers that mostly symbolised a conventional moral panic left over from the strange danger of the 70s. At a time where moral guardians like the British Board of Film Classification were starting to crack down on horror movies viewed as obscene, with the Video Recordings Act of 1984, and the list of video nasties that got banned or even prosecuted for violent or obscene content. Despite Hellraiser not actually appearing on this list itself, it was banned in Ontario for brutal graphic violence with bloodletting throughout, horror, degradation and torture. But Hellraiser actually kinda needed that to work, because a huge amount of the symbolism and themes of Hellraiser is abuse. Some people have accused Hellraiser and Clive Barker of demonising the BDSM community by use of the associated garb on demonic torturers. But Emily Rothbauer's essay, A Lineage of Literary Influence on Modern BDSM Communities, puts it better than I ever could. Horror films like Hellraiser, which contain supernatural creatures and magic, are so distant from reality that they cannot be reasonably taken as informational. Their fantastical elements are constant reminders to the audience that what is on screen is not a depiction of empirical truth, nor should it be treated as such. And this renders mainstream audiences unlikely to assume that Hellraiser has any significant insight to offer about how real BDSM scenes operate. In both Hellraiser and the novel The Hellbound Heart that it was based on, Clive Barker drew on the images and fantasies of BDSM while using otherworldly and horror elements to distance it from actual BDSM relationships. Unlike, say, 50 Shades of Grey, a series widely lambasted for how badly it depicts safe, sane and consensual BDSM. The Cenobites look like they're wearing kink gear, but are emotionally detached from the humans around them, and have their voices manipulated to emphasise that comparing them to a normal human in a normal human relationship is redundant. I've read from members of the BDSM community about how Hellraiser and its aesthetic have been a boon to the kink community, by inspiring new fantasies. Hellraiser is a common image in the BDSM community now, which is a massive achievement for a film that resonates so much with that subculture to also have mainstream success. And there's one particular actor who is indisputably the key to that success. What made Pinhead such an immortal character, and Hellraiser such a bankable franchise, was unquestionably Doug Bradley's performance as the Hell Priest. Because nobody else could have played this guy. You have to remember that Hellraiser was made in 1987, when horror movies as a whole were about to enter a dark age of terrible, thoughtless schlock for about 10 years, until Scream basically revived the genre by itself in 1996. At that time, horror comedies had really started to pop off, with The Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, Friday the 13th Part 6 Jason Lives, Evil Dead 2 and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 all pushing their respective franchises in a more light-hearted horror comedy direction to good financial success. But that same comic direction is what led to most of these horror franchises dying out by the mid-90s, because the characters that had made them so memorably scary back in the early to mid-80s were becoming a joke, milked over and over again by their studios to the point they lost the bite they used to have. Pinhead and Hellraiser were a breath of fresh air compared to other horror icons at the time, because Pinhead was never treated as anything other than a serious threat. He didn't cackle like some sort of Saturday morning cartoon villain, he didn't make cheap puns, he wasn't tapping his nose and winking at the camera, as generic blonde girl number 7 screams plaintively in his next overly elaborate murder set piece. Even in the absolute worst Hellraiser movies, and there are some stinkers, Bradley's performances remained phenomenal. The only two movies that he didn't appear in were Hellraiser Revelations and Hellraiser Judgment, and both movies were widely panned, especially Revelations. I think it's fair to say that Doug Bradley's association with the role is so strong that recasting Pinhead is basically a sin. He's up there with Tobin Bell as John Kramer and Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger, as a horror character defined by the actor that played them. Sorry, Jackie. What made Pinhead shine even in his worst appearances was Bradley's imperious detachment from Pinhead's victims. He wasn't a frothing maniac, or a giggling tormentor, or a silent skulking slasher. His affect was more like a wizard or a judge, who pretty much never got his hands dirty physically. He doesn't run, he doesn't brawl, he doesn't even really raise his voice. Which brings me to Pinhead's inclusion into Dead by Daylight. I think a lot of people would agree with me here, with the bold claim I'm about to make. Hellraiser is the best licensed release Behaviour has ever pulled off, or at least up there with the all-time greats Halloween, Saw and Silent Hill. The people over at Behaviour have not only managed to create a genuinely unique, thematic and engaging power suite for Pinhead, proving to any doubters they have not even come close to running out of ideas of powers yet, they've also managed to do it without sacrificing any of the identity that made Pinhead such a staple of horror throughout the late 80s and 90s. For those who don't know, Pinhead's power is a multi-part power, not dissimilar to the Pig, the Executioner or the Demogorgon. There's the active part used in chasing known as the Possessed Chain, and the passive minigame but caused by the lament configuration. Possessed chains give him a measure of directional slowing from a distance, kinda like Clown's bottles as he snares survivors, forcing them to break the chains or get slowed to a crawl. Something like this had to be his primary method of attack, I think, since Pinhead more or less never exerts himself physically in the movies. His basic attack also highlights this physical detachment from his victims. He strikes with simple hand gestures, in a game where all the other killers, even the other supernatural ones, directly hit you with a weapon, or with their bare hands. It's a great display of how animation showcases identity. Pinhead exists beyond our mortal realm, and doesn't have our pedestrian human concepts of physical aggression. All his other animations, including his pickup, his grab, pallet break, and especially Mori animations, also fit this angle of physical attachment from his victims. But more about those later. Before I get round to them, I'd like to talk about the lament configuration and the chain hunt dynamic. It creates a mini-game where the lament configuration, the box that summons and controls the Cenobites, allows Pinhead to exert some 1v4 map pressure by creating a sadistic choice, kind of similar to the one that Plague gives you, that leaves survivors with a few options, none of which are good, that they have to work around. When the lament configuration spawns, it's only a matter of time before Pinhead's power reaches its apex as he rampages without the fetters to hold him back. This is manifested in the chain hunt. The survivors are constantly harassed by chains, to the point that getting in a chase with Pinhead during a chain hunt is pretty much death sentence. This is not only an engaging gameplay mechanic that turns a cat and mouse chase into a treasure hunt, but also is surprisingly thematic, because the lament configuration is the weapon used by Kirsty Cotton to dispatch Cenobites at the end of the movie. The Cenobites can't be harmed by mundane weapons, so the only thing to stop their crusade is to use their own occult magic against them, and yet indulging one's curiosity and drawing the attention of the Cenobites by solving the lament configuration might give you a little more than salvation. In the immortal words of the Hell Priest himself, words that have been memed to hell by the terminally horny DBD community in record time.
The box. You opened it. I came.
If you open the funny box, then Pinhead will be shown your location on his unique Killer Instinct notification and can teleport to you. You have given in to the temptation to use the power of the lament configuration, and now you will deal with the consequences that you have brought unto yourself. And the particle effects and animations associated with these disparate power elements all fit super well together as a tribute to the original Hellraiser movie. Far from the red and black ashy effects common to the entity, Pinhead is lit up by electric blue lights and particles around the possessed chain gateways, the element configuration, and animations such as window vault and teleport. These are excellent modernizations of the blue lightning effects that were everywhere in the original movie. If Hellraiser was remade shot for shot today, this is probably how the effects would look, and we shouldn't be surprised as to how loyal these little details are. Mathieu Cote himself said that Hellraiser was the dream license of many of Behavior's developers. In many ways, this release is their ultimate labour of love and devotion to this titan of horror history. That love shines through when you look at his add-ons too. Every single one is a shout out to that first movie. From props that set the eerie tone for the movie, to personal effects of Pinhead and his retinue. The Chatterer's tooth, for example, comes from Pinhead's eternal companion, the Chatterer. The greasy black lens is property of Butterball, and the impaling wire comes from the female Cenobite, commonly known as Deep Throat. On top of that, one of his iridescent add-ons, the Engineer's Fang, belongs to this, I can only call it a giant penis scorpion demon that attacks Kirsty after she first opens the element configuration. But this kind of stuff is par the course for licensed killers. Shout outs to their movies or games in their add-on descriptions, it's not uncommon. But what is uncommon is making Pinhead the first killer ever to speak English, quoting some of the most famous lines from the original movie. I don't know whether they actually got Doug Bradley to do the voice, or whether they merely got someone doing a very good impression of him, but they got the likeness down, so it's not unreasonable to expect they got big man Doug himself in to voice his iconic character once again for his teleport and his Mori. And speaking of which, the Mori. Oh god, that Mori is everything wonderful about Pinhead summed up in one grisly, unforgettable animation. And a gesture from the Hell Priest chains and snare the unlucky survivor, stretching their skin just as Frank Cotton's was stretched at the end of Hellraiser when Pinhead utters the same threat he gave to Kirsty earlier in the movie.
We'll tear your soul apart.
The torture pillar that Frank was flayed against in Hellraiser Cenobites rises, and the survivor is bound by the hooks in their flesh to it, before Pinhead drags them to hell for an eternity of torment. Unlike most Moris, the body is not left behind, which is a nice touch to really sell how to Brazil these survivors have gone. And this is for the people who are going to ask me what that means lore-wise. Remember how Frank Cotton returned from hell at the start of Hellraiser, or how Julia came back in the sequel? Blood was spilled on the ground that they were taken from in the first place. And remember, this is the entity's realm, blood gets shed there every day. The survivors probably aren't taken for very long, but suffice to say what they get up to when they're there, and the process of returning from it, can't be too pleasant. I think a lot of people would agree with me if I said that Pinhead was a masterpiece, plain and simple. I do not believe they could have done him better. From the visuals, to the gameplay, to the animations, to the voice work, to the model, to the constant barrage of references and homages to the original Hellraiser movie. The red carpet really has been rolled out, and no killer deserved it more. And I really hope Pinhead is the start of a new age for Behaviour, because after the last couple of releases really shook the community and damaged a lot of people's trust in Behaviour and its game, we really needed something like this right now. It's very clear to me that Pinhead was made with the utmost faithfulness to the original IP because the developers decided to go absolutely all out on the elements that made him unique among slashers of the late 80s and 90s. And we can only hope that with future releases, both original and licensed, Behaviour maintains that momentum and strives to continue to make unique and interesting killer designs with power to suit them. I can't imagine that any Hellraiser fan would be disappointed or underwhelmed with what the Cenobite has brought to the table. And I can't wait to play the shit out of him when he goes live. Well done, Behaviour, you've really nailed this one. Oh, but maybe buff him. He probably needs it. Let him see the element configuration when he's close to it. Make chains a little harder to break and maybe tweak some of the add-ons, and then we're in business. Okay, so that's everything I have to say about the fantastic Hellraiser DLC coming in early September. If you're interested in what's to come, then please do subscribe, and you should be, because the first year anniversary of this channel is coming up at the end of the month, and I've planned out my next collaboration, so do stay tuned for those. In the description you can find links to my Twitch, my Twitter, my Discord, my Patreon and Ko-fi if you feel like this content is worth your money. There's a lovely Victor t-shirt, so do go check it out. That's all from me for now, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.